Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Housing Counseling call for May 21st. Glad everybody's on the call. We're let us know if you can hear clearly. I know we had a little bit of technical difficulty at the beginning of the call, so let us know if there's a problem, and hopefully it's all going to work smoothly. So we got a crowded agenda today and some good guests. We want to run through the Federal Housing Counseling quick update. We had a terrific and pretty interesting meeting with the administration on yesterday, and Ellie Pepper is going to join us from Empire Justice Center. We're going to talk about what we about the broad-ranging conversation, and we have these two discussion papers we circulated earlier today. Should be in your inbox if you haven't seen them yet. One on core principles for effective housing counseling, and a second one on the federal strategy for building awareness about housing counseling with the public. So we'll talk about that in some depth, I hope. Was pretty interesting, and people have wide respect for the work you're doing out in the field, so it was satisfying in that way too. We are going to spend a few minutes on the questions of financial capability and on the rental housing counseling standards, which the industry standards have proposed. And we just need to decide whether we've got some thoughts that we need to share with them that we want to do as an NHRC proposal. Certainly people should feel free to submit their own as well. But if there's some thoughts that people have about it in general, let's pull it together. We don't need to submit anything. It's more a question of if we feel like there's a burning need, and we're glad to do that. We'll have somebody from the field as well join us to discuss her thoughts on it. And Ellie, I hope, will stay on the phone and share her thoughts as well. And then very briefly, just where we landed with the Housing Counseling Federal Advisory Board nominations, and our continuing push to get improvements with HCO, Home Counselor Online, and our work with FHFA. So with that on hand, Matthew, do you want to jump in and give us quickly where things stand on federal funding?
Yeah, there isn't a whole lot new to say on this. The thing that's changed since the last call is that the full Appropriations Committee in the House voted and passed the FUD bill. So the funding, we had worked on trying to get an amendment to get the funding increased, but the bottom line from the subcommittee staff was that the places where amendments usually find money for amendments to offset increases in administrative costs, and that those have been kind of squeezed dry. So we did work with Charlie Dent's office to try to get it increased, but we're not able to. So the funding levels are what they were at the subcommittee, which is $47 million level funding for HUD housing counseling assistance and $42 million for NFMC. The next steps, the full House will have a vote on it. The one thing to mention there is that we are considering whether to try to get an amendment offered in front of the full House. The thinking on that is not especially that it would be likely to be passed, but that having a vote on it could be helpful, especially in terms of seeing where we have support, and particularly among Republicans. So we're working also with Congressman Dent's office on that to see if that's just kind of strategizing on that. And we do still have an opportunity at the Senate to try to get higher numbers, and are continuing to work on that. I think that's all I've got, Bruce, on the federal funding, unless you want to add anything.
No, I think that sums it up. We'll still continue pressing. We'll still work in the Senate. You have to work through the whole process during the course of the year. It's just a never-ending game, and we'll have to keep our eyes on it continually. We're trying to avoid taking any losses. Obviously, we want to increase, but and so this is a difficult time, and we'll keep pushing. Good. Okay. So we had a terrific meeting yesterday with the administration around prioritizing housing counseling and its programs. And I've invited Ellie Pepper to join us from Empire Justice Center, who was part of the team that was on the call. Ellie, are you with us?
I'm here.
Oh, good, great. Always glad to have you. And help me out here. So, also representing the Housing Counseling meeting, the team was, let's see, Seema Agnani from National Capacity, Simone Griffin from Home Free USA, Ellie was there. Let's see,
Karen.
Diaz.
Oh, sorry.
Karen
Halbrecht from NeighborWorks.
Karen Hoskins from NeighborWorks, yeah. Lot Diaz from NCLR. Have we left anybody out? Apologize if we did. But anyways, a good group of people. And the other fascinating thing I thought was the deep representation from the White House side. So we always have Seth Wheeler, who's been coordinating this. He is leaving the White House probably in the next month or so. But Mike Stegman, Dr. Michael Stegman, who was the senior housing person in Treasury, has transferred and is now at HUD as of last Monday. So this is one of his earliest meetings. He has a long storied history in housing work and is both well respected and is one of the people who really pushed for principal reduction at Treasury and trying to get it more broadly accepted at FHFA. So kind of a deep thinker about the work. He was at the meeting. We had Ed Golding, who's the new FHA commissioner, there as well. Of course, we had Sarah Jarick there as her bailiwick, as well as a number of the agencies represented. But these folks were all very senior level, and that's reflected in the conversation. So, Ellie, what do you think? What were some of the high points? What should counselors know about? I guess we should probably explain sort of what the purpose of the meeting was. Do you want to do that, or should I?
You go ahead, Bruce. This was
okay.
Bruce did a great job of really. It's amazing that the people that were at the table. I was just amazed that so many people from pretty high levels were involved and engaged. So.
And this is all a tribute to the work you're doing out in the field. So you should be deeply aware that these folks are becoming increasingly aware of the depth of the work that we do, the value in the foreclosure crisis, and what got referenced several times was the value of the work in trying to increase home ownership again. And those are the two focal points. I know that counseling does more than that, but we're struggling with how to get a world where at the White House one day they're dealing with drones and the next day it's flyovers and all this stuff. So how do you get their attention? And so we're narrowing our focus when we talk to them around and access to credit. It seems to be the key issue for them that they're most interested in. So it's as many of you have said to me whenever I bring this up, that we should also say that the foreclosure crisis isn't over. So there were two goals, or two themes, and we sent out the discussion papers we used, and these were meant to really frame the issue for them. These aren't fixed documents. These are meant to be a way to create some deeper strategy in the administration. So the first problem, and I think we've talked about this a lot on these calls in the past, there's no consistent message. The dots aren't connected between the agencies on housing counseling, so that you can have HUD working on HUD-approved housing counseling agencies and certification for counselors, and you can have FHFA talking about housing counseling provided by mortgage insurers after the mortgage application has been submitted and between then and closing, and they're treated as if they're the same activities. And what we wanted to say is, so the core principles were, things like HUD-approved housing counseling agencies ought to be the way that when you say housing counseling, that's what you're talking about. You're not talking about something else that somebody else does that does part of our work, but has neither the independence nor the depth. And so there's a bunch of those things on that list, and what we're trying to do is get them to be more defined on it. and harmonize them across the board so that there's a much deeper integration of counseling into the work that they do. The second part of the conversation was this one that I think you all bring up to me a lot, which is people in the public aren't aware of housing counseling and only come to it when they're in trouble or because there was some program that required it. They come a little bit grudgingly. And what can we do to create an atmosphere that says to people before they make a major financial decision, they go to a counselor. This we're sort of envisioning as individual agencies can do a little bit of this, but that much of this needs to come from the White House and make them kind of the point place where things flow out from. So, and the struggle has been, we've had several of these meetings with the administration like this to make it more concrete and get them to be more engaged. And not so much, we're going to sit down and we're going to have a chat, we're going to walk away, but what are the action items to move forward? So that's what we were trying to move to the next level on this conversation. So let me stop there. And Ellie, what do you think worked in it? What should people know in the field?
Well, a couple of big things came out for me. First of all, I thought it was very interesting that Ed Golding, who is the commissioner of FHA, said that he thought that one of the reasons that there wasn't more out in the public about housing counseling and the importance of it being HUD approved is that it seemed to him that HUD approval was a relatively simple process and that it didn't necessarily, make it any more important than a for-profit organization. And so we had a discussion about that. It was great that he brought it up. We did get to kind of give him some information about the level of approval and how important it is, and that it is not an easy process, and that it is actually there's some pretty stringent requirements, and going through the biannual approval is, again, not a simple process, and HUD is pretty specific about it. And that, again, the movement towards the certification process for housing counselors is another good step to really bring up the level of professionalism in the industry. And I do want to comment that Bruce did try once again to get information about when that is going to be finalized, and the answer from Sarah Jury was that it's still in rulemaking. So although another attempt was made to find out a date, that was not forthcoming.
She's just struggling with this. It's so painful for her.
Yeah.
She really wants to tell us, but
although she did mention that one of the challenges that's causing it to be such a delay is having to figure out the technology side to be able to do the training. And I got the impression that she was kind of tipping her hat that it was going to be an online sort of thing, which is not a surprise, but is news if that's the case.
Yes, yeah. So that was the one thing. I mean, there was a lot of conversation regarding, we really got into a pretty lengthy conversation about the FHFA requirement for housing counseling. However, the requirement does not include that it be a HUD-approved housing counseling agency, and that they're using mortgage insurance companies' programs, and in fact, in the case of, I think it's Freddie, correct me if I'm wrong, they're using the actual loan officer can provide the housing counseling component. We had a lot of talk about that and how much it seems like there's a conflict of interest for a loan officer to be providing housing counseling when a HUD-approved counselor is much more separated from the process and better able to really ensure that the homeowner gets the best possible product for their need and for their situation. They did seem to hear that. Bill Merrill from FHFA said that both Fannie and Freddie are required to do a scorecard as a part of their scorecard to review their housing counseling process. So hopefully that's going to, come out. We talked about the fact that the online program that the mortgage insurance companies use doesn't have really any clear way to validate that the potential home buyer has actually paid attention to it and been able to, kind of take in any of the information and make it part of their actual knowledge, and that we aren't against online training, but that just wasn't the best possible way to do it. And
let me jump in on all this. I think this is exactly right. This was a major part of the conversation. It was clear that people like Stegman and Ed Golding, and certainly Sarah, really understood that there was a difference between what we were providing as HUD-approved housing counseling agencies and what the mortgage insurers would do. And it was kind of a validating moment. It was kind of a relief to hear it. Bill Merrill at FHFA, very decent guy, been in business a long time in many roles, didn't defend, but was absolutely clear on that FHFA was not there on this question yet. So the hope was that the scorecard piece would kind of force the issue. Force the issue is probably a stronger way to say it than they were said it in the meeting. And then Bill says, we're going to look at the data and see what the data shows us about whether counseling works or not. To which we then had to, again, this is why you have these principles. We had to say, well, you don't want to look at the data and just look at what the mortgage insurers do, or just include or pull it all together, because that's going to dumb down the data. You want to be able to separate out what HUD-approved housing counseling agencies do from what the others are doing, and which, given our modus operandi is to work before the people go to loan application, and are going to give us a much broader range of information. I think will create much more value. But it was that level of conversation that was actually kind of good. We got into the weeds on these kind of questions. So, sure.
Yeah, and I have to say that one of the most exciting aspects of the whole meeting for me was that Ed Golding, the commissioner of FHA, brought up the idea of let's give a homeowner some credit towards their interest rate or their points and fees if they are involved in HUD-approved housing counseling. Let's look at that, if there's a way to do that, and is there a way to then maybe pay for the service that the housing counseling agency is providing. So that was a very exciting thing, that conversation, Bruce, Matthew, and I, and none of the other housing counseling agencies brought that up. Ed brought that up himself, and that conversation was, Mike Stegman was very interested in the conversation. Bill Merrill seemed to be interested in the conversation. They continued the conversation beyond our meeting. Once we broke up, they continued to speak about it together. They mentioned that they were going to have further meetings about that to figure out how to work that. So that was very exciting for me, that they're willing to have that kind of a conversation. And Sarah Juriek did mention...
Let me add just a little bit to that, too. So one of the ideas that they had was actually that where the lender has the client get counseled, that they pay a lower fee on the loan. It's the LLPA fee. So it's a lower fee that they would pay for the loan. And then so that's like the opposite of Hawk in a way, because the incentives were going to the consumer. In this one, the incentive goes to the lender, and then the idea is that the lender would pass through the savings to the counseling agency on the theory that that's how they can get the business, and if the counseling agencies will work for them if they get funded. So a little tricky because it's not guaranteed that there'll be a pass-through. But it was definitely the kind of deeper thinking about how lending might work that would integrate housing counseling.
Yeah, and the Office of Housing Counseling is also working to clarify to lenders that they can indeed pay for pre-purchase counseling and add it to, closing costs of mortgages. So those were those were kind of the highlights for me.
Yeah. I think that's a great summary of the conversation. I mean, we spent a fair amount of time walking through the kind of elements that we didn't know if they'd be controversial or not. That one of the things we have seen is there have been attempts to say that you please go ahead and counsel them, do all your magic stuff that you do, but it's not okay for you to talk to people about going into bankruptcy as a solution. Or with HECM loans, that you're not allowed to advise somebody to go see a particular lender, or especially to avoid a particular lender. And there are some very bad reverse mortgage mills out there that have had deep problems in them, and counselors not being able to tell them it's been a difficult problem. Similarly, that you can't tell people this loan is a good idea for you or it's not. And I know that counselors do kind of an extra step and say, you have a reverse mortgage, and we might want to compare it with this with a home equity loan if you're doing repairs. And the nice thing with this is that you'll have much more equity left in your house at the end of the loan. You have those sort of indirect conversations, but the idea that a counselor can't share their professional advice and experience fully, you'd never accept that in a doctor's field. And we should, so we're trying to build that into the principles going forward. And, I didn't know if that would be controversial or not, but, it's interesting. They all got it right away. You can understand it. We wanted to have that instead of having to reinvent the metrics with every program and have different reporting standards, that they use the 9902 standards. Because we're all going to collect that no matter what, and that ought to be the base for any reporting for any relationship with a housing counseling agency. They were on board and pleased with this, about notifying consumers about the availability of housing counseling. And we actually, to be honest, we've been recommending that people use the CFPB Find a Counselor tool over the HUD.gov tool, because it's just a lot easier. You put in your zip code and you find the stuff that's there. And that's been a real help. I think I'm looking at the list here. We did talk a little bit about other ways to encourage other stakeholders to help fund housing counseling, and did mention this idea of is there a way to create a funding pool through Fannie and Freddie, where some money gets set aside from the servicing strip, and that those funds then would create a counseling pool. And FHFA kind of asked sort of matter-of-factly, should it be a fee for service, or should it be a lump sum grant program? And, you always want to reply, well, I think more is always better in this case when it comes to money. That, the off-the-cuff thought was fee for service is helpful for paying for every person that gets counseled. Lump sum is important for building capacity and covering things like training and technology upgrades. We need both, so it'd be ideal to have a mix. So not to say that this program's in place, but that, it's engaged as part of the conversation, and we're going to continue talking about that. Ellie, you have some more thoughts here on what we covered here?
Yeah, there's looking through my notes here, I remember the individual from the comptroller, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. She mentioned one of the things that they're doing is they're educating banks on the CRA funding for housing counseling and what they can do with it, and making sure that they understand that they can also get credit for providing technical assistance funding to housing counseling agencies. So specifically, she mentioned, if somebody needs, help with upgrading their systems, their technology systems, if they need help with, that kind of issue, that is, they are trying to educate the different lenders that they can use that and fund that kind of thing and get CRA credit for it. It doesn't have to just be direct service with homeowners. So that was interesting. I wanted to make sure everybody knew that is being put out there, because I think moving forward a lot of organizations have that issue, finding the money to upgrade technology. I think that it was interesting. Sarah did mention that they are working to create and to follow some specific metrics in housing counseling so that they can better quantify the success rates rather than just you saw this many homeowners and they bought this many bought homes. They are looking at metrics like how many people opened up a savings account, how many people got an improved credit score by the end of their sessions, and so on, so that they can better quantify the service and put it out there how important it is.
And actually, I think that Sarah sort of framed this as, so the 9902 is excellent on information fields that the housing counselor knows the answer to. But that a lot of the outcomes we want to know about were things that the counselor doesn't know, doesn't have access to, like sometimes did the loan close, did the modification perform, those kinds of things. Counselors don't always have that information, or as you might say, did the credit score improve? So they were going to argue that research should be able to be used to establish those. So the idea is we report on the information fields that we know about, and then there's follow-up that happens in some more research-oriented framework to identify performance standards and actual outcomes.
Yeah, and in the area of performance measurement, Bruce did a really great job of jumping right in there to say this is the perfect reason why there should be something on the mortgage application for GSE loans saying whether or not they participated in housing counseling, and not just whether they participated, but who the housing counseling agency was, and to be, to ensure that you can separate between HUD approved and non-HUD approved when trying to figure out metrics. So it was a great, it was a great moment.
And we also learned that, so for those of you who've been on these calls for a while, you may remember last year there was a lot of talk about MISMO. So I'm not going to remember what the name MISMO stands for, but these are a set of data fields that the entire financial service industry has been working on that would be attached to the mortgage, and they would be standardized data fields. So a huge amount of work has been going on for years. A huge amount of work has been involved in it, and it includes some housing counseling fields that we identified. So that was the big news, was that MISMO has adopted the data fields that would be included on the that we were proposing for the mortgage application. I know there's a few of you MISMO followers out there, so MISMO resurfaced, and we're in. So that was really good news.
Yeah, so I mean, otherwise, again, as I said before, the big thing for me was how involved, everybody at the table really was. Mike Stegman, especially, I will say, he asked a lot of really on-point questions. He clearly was trying to understand what it was we were talking about and exactly what was needed and what was important. And that was great. And the only other comment that I have is that Ed Golding had the best socks on.
Really?
Yeah, he had these multicolored striped socks. So
Well, the other great thing was he came a little bit late because he was doing a speech in Georgetown, and he came with his bike helmet, so he clearly had ridden his bike across D.C.
Yeah.
So little bits of personal information here. So we did, most of the meeting was, actually, is there more to say on the principles before I jump around a little bit?
No.
Okay, good. So we did kind of an inventory of what the agencies are doing. They self-reported on what they were doing with counseling initiatives, almost all of which was very positive. And then with the remaining minutes, we mapped out this idea of a federal strategy for building public awareness for housing counseling. And the goal here was to use existing resources, not to ask for new money, but that what they do, there are ways to build housing counseling in a reputational thing. So our own Matthew Goodrow here had the proposal that we have a housing counselor be invited to the State of the Union address and sit next to Michelle Obama, and that the president talk about housing counseling during the speech. And I think Linda Ingram jumped in when that suggestion was made and suggested that they come with a homeowner as well. That was pretty cool. So that did get it's popped up a little bit on that one during the meeting. And, you know, it's a bunch of those kind of things where when Joe Biden is traveling around the country, can he visit a housing counseling agency and participate in a closing and do a news event? Can we get senior administration officials to do things that highlight housing counseling? Can we message housing counseling more consistently so that there's more visibility of this? I've been trying to encourage this idea of doing some field meetings or hearings where this all gets out much more in the public, and instead of a lot of DC-based things that happen in Kansas City or Albuquerque or Sacramento or, you know, around the country in different locations, and trying to get the Fed to think about this. So, the response here was less, you know, so Seth handled the question and referred to it as throwing the gauntlet down. So yeah, sure, we threw the gauntlet down. His response was, I'm not sure if we can get to doing a federal strategy. Things happen a little more chaotically or spontaneously, where they're saying, well, the president's going to be here, what should we do? We have this particular need, and then they start brainstorming ideas. And because we do these regular meetings, housing counseling gets to be on that list, and they'd be interested in that. What we were trying to do, which weren't successful this time, but we'll keep doing, is trying to get them to just assign somebody who might think about this a little bit and might be on the staff, and then see if we can't get a more consistent approach. So right now, it really is just a piece of paper. We haven't gotten integration on this one. I don't think we've got as much traction as on the policies, but it's definitely, yeah, you can tell they're interested in it and want to do things with it. And Ed Golding went out of his way during the meeting and then afterwards to say that, you know, this will be an area of lots of attention on HUD's side. HUD will certainly do much more than its share on trying to implement these programs. And did a nice pat on the back a verbal pat on the back to Sarah and her team. It was very, very positive, and I think we'll get some good attention from him and on a senior level. Ginger Charles, if you know who she is at HUD, was planning to be there, ended up being out of town and meeting. So I think we do have some pretty senior people there really looking at this and supporting Sarah's work. So this will be, I think, a very positive outcome. And there have been some stories they're going to have to rush out to a cabinet meeting. They didn't do that. They actually stayed around for a while. and chatted, and as Ellie referenced, some of the chat was, how could we figure out some financial incentives around the counseling? So, this was really where we wanted to be at, and it's moved the stuff a little bit forward. We don't have slight of victory, but it was part of the process. Really wanted to share it with you all because many of you have contributed to this. I thought, we've talked a little bit about our sort of ups and downs with FHFA, and it really did, in other parts of the government where we can't tell you what to do, but this year would make a lot of sense. And there was one more thing that Ed said that I thought was terrific, which was when the FHFA guy said, well, we're still trying to look at the evidence to find the evidence to show that housing counseling works. And Ed said, you have dozens of programs, but you don't require that level of scrutiny. Why is this one particular program where there's actually a lot of good evidence held to a much higher standard than other programs? And I'd be glad to talk to you more about that in depth, in this nice way that other people talk to each other. So that was good.
Yeah, that was a great moment.
Right. Good. Well, do you have any closing thoughts on this, or should we move just to the standards?
No, I think it's great, and they're willing to talk, and we should keep moving, and they're willing to continue with regular meetings, and so it's great. Good.
So let's pause for a second, and we are going to move on to this question of the new financial capability standards and the rental housing counseling standards that the national industry standards have put up and asked for comment. So Susan Lagville was kind enough to email in about this last week, or a couple weeks ago, with some thoughts. And is she on? We have not connected. Okay. Well, let me know if she does come in. So, Ellie, do you have some initial thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Did I dive in? What do you?
Yeah, I mean, my big concern is around privacy of any type of counseling standard, I guess. So it's not specifically listed in the housing counseling standards that are already in existence, but the last session that you had, Bruce, with the issues around addressing the needs of millennials and marketing to millennials, and the fact that we're moving towards a more technological type of counseling, whether it be video or teleconferencing or live chats or whatever, a lot more internet and cloud-based work. I just have more concerns about keeping people's records private and information private. And because, again, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation about our meeting, that is an issue. So many groups are going to need to update their technology and to kind of have a standard for what your technology should be in order to protect privacy of the clients that you're working with.
And so you think that the standards ought to have more detail on the privacy issues? Is that the gist here?
That they should have more,
yeah.
Or that they do have more?
Well, actually, what's your response?
Yeah, I mean, they should have more. There isn't. It just says one sentence that there should be systems in place to protect privacy, and I think there should be more detail about that. What type of system? There should be an exact standard, because everybody is going to interpret that in a different way. For instance, there's a requirement from HUD about different, there's specific client management systems that are accepted to be used to promulgate and send your data to HUD. So, along those lines, there should be a specific, these are acceptable, standards for technology. And I am not a technological person, so I don't even know where to begin to say what those standards should be. I just think that they should be there.
Right.
We need to find somebody who can say what they should be.
Okay. So has anybody else written in? Okay, so feel free if you've got some thoughts about these standards. I'm going to throw out a couple things on the rental area, and I think this is important for us partly because this is an area we haven't examined as much as we do our home ownership and our foreclosure counseling and even our reverse mortgage. It's actually a big part of our business, just not done by a somewhat different array of organizations. Actually, let me pause for a moment and raise another interesting issue that Sarah mentioned. I knew was kicking around, but had not heard it public, and I should alert groups to. So one of the controversies that around the certification standards that exist is that who do they apply to? And it's not just HUD-approved housing counseling agencies, it's any housing counseling activities funded by the federal government. And that's from the wording of the Dodd-Frank legislation. The reason that's important is that counseling that's done through CDBG grants, which in the past has not been required to be done by HUD-approved housing counseling agencies, funding done through the family services, whatever it's called, the public housing programs, and something around at HUD, and hard to imagine they don't come out on the side of saying that it's a broader piece. So that's actually an area that, as managers of organizations, you should be aware of that's coming up in the future. So let's see. Going back to the rental counseling, I mean, I glanced through this, and I'd love to hear from groups that really do rental counseling. The benchmarks do not seem particularly onerous, and so the benchmark for counseling rental cases, I mean, there's a lot of them, but they tend to be the things you would expect a counselor to do anyways. And then the standard for rental counselors are to do a formal intake, needs assessment, and a written action plan. Seems fairly easy, and well, one would expect. And then there is a recommended benchmark where appropriate rental counselors should review and analyze clients' credit report. So I know this has been a flashpoint for credit counselors, for rental counselors, because a lot of what counselors talk about in the rental context have nothing to do with credit, and what is a requirement you pull a credit report doesn't make any sense if you're there because you have a problem with unsafe conditions in your apartment, or trying to get your security deposit back. So they say where appropriate. So I guess that makes it conditional. I think one might want to strengthen that a little bit. And they have on the expected counseling outcomes, understanding when you counsel people, the client should understand the following. So one is renting versus buying. So does everybody need to be talked to about buying if they're not interested in buying, if they're only in renting? So that's a good question, and I don't know. There may be a good logic behind this. It's certainly something you would want to do for somebody who's choosing to buy, because that's a real alternative. But for many people who are in the rental market, why would you be talking to them about that? Rental affordability, public assistance programs, availability, understanding the terms of rental agreement, rights and responsibilities of tenants, consequences of breaking a lease, eviction process, and fair housing law regulations. And these seem most really aimed at people who are trying to get into an apartment. or trying to find a new place, that sort of thing. When I did rental, I used to be a tenant organizer way back in the days when I still had hair and I was a young guy. We're talking in the 1970s. And a lot of what we came up with were issues around what you call warranty of habitability. So places where the apartment was not being maintained, and warranty about habitability says that you're warranting that the apartment would be habitable, and if it's not, then even the state of Massachusetts, where I was organizing, you could withhold rent. You can't do that everywhere, but dealing with that question of are the repairs being made? Is the apartment safe? That's a big issue in kind of older and low and moderate income rental situations. Those have you don't necessarily have to meet the gamut of what's on that list. Getting your deposit refunded was another big issue that we had. We'd door knock people and they'd say, "Yeah, I never got my refund from my previous place," and they required 2 months. It was a lot of money and all that sort of thing. So it's worth thinking if we want to spend some time on this. I wouldn't want to do this unilaterally. I'd want to do it if there are groups doing rental counseling who have opinions, and we can do it there. There's one interesting thing which was on their files. They say that at the time of disposal, files should be shredded. My understanding is that a lot of files now get burned as opposed to shredding, so incinerated, I guess, is the term of art. And the other thing is that they said that you should utilize an electronic utilize an electronic client management system. And I don't know that one exists for rentals, so I'd be interested in hearing that. They do say in the text that you can use your own Excel spreadsheet or Access database, but would love to know if there are CMSs for the rental situation. Let's hear from people who are in the rental counseling field, and if they're not on the phone, it's eventually for them to see if they want to participate. My feeling with all of these things is that we're glad to do this if there's interest among you folks about doing it. If not, we're happy to do other things and can weigh in.
No one's weighed in yet, but I'll just share a few comments.
Okay.
Quickly, so to your question on the CMSs and rental counseling, you can use CMAX or HGO for rental counseling. On the credit counseling and renting, a few people pointed out that a lot of landlords will have a minimum credit score requirement, and so it can be helpful for counselors working with rental counseling clients for them to better understand their credit report and address any errors and that sort of thing. And there's just one other person weighed in on the privacy piece that it was Laura Bucksbaum from CEI in Maine, said that she essentially said that she thought the existing standards were sufficient on the privacy piece. So that's obviously there's room for disagreement there, and that's something to think about.
Good, and we just put our heads together there, because I think both Ellie and Laura are very thoughtful people here, and I think this would be we can think through this in a good way. Good. Well, let me move. So let me just say what Susan was going to bring up. She was concerned on the financial capability issue that there was a requirement that we counsel people around investments. And her thought was, is this more than we can bite off? Is this more than we can manage? And so I thought that was a good one to ask about. And so if people want to weigh in on that as well, that would be great. Okay, so and you didn't have any more thoughts about the financial capability, did you, Ellie?
No.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Well,
so I do just want to clarify about the privacy. So in general, there are some very specific standards for maintaining somebody's privacy, and I don't dispute that. But there isn't really anything specific about online and technological privacy. So there's, of course, you're expected to maintain people's privacy when you're emailing things, but the problem is that you may think that you have a secure system when it's not, maybe not the most secure system. So that's kind of where I'm going with that is, is there a standard for, using your iPhone if you have a certain level of security? Is there a standard for using your the system that you have in your office? So like that.
Good. Well, and we'll need to give Laura a chance. Maybe the two of you can talk, and we'll bring in a smaller group to kind of think this all through.
Great.
I think there's also the challenge of running a small agency and trying to meet all these standards are difficult. And so let's have that conversation. Both of you are valued thinkers and thought leaders in our world here. Okay, so let's just, and so the standards are due June 12th. We need to decide whether we're going to actually submit something or not. We can do that in the next week or two, but so anybody else who wants to weigh in, shoot us an email. That would be great. Let's move on, Matthew. Got a couple more minutes here, and so the Federal Advisory Committee on Housing Counseling. What a terrific conversation. I totally appreciate everybody's input on this, and I know there were a lot of very good nominations out there, and we didn't even begin to touch on many of them. I only learned about some of them the day that submissions needed to be made, and even some afterwards. And there's lots of good people, and please don't think that not making this list has any reflection on you. We're so impressed with the work that people are doing out there. What we were trying to do is to figure out how to make sure that there weren't some big holes that would not be filled that would reflect on our industry. And so I do feel like there's lots of other good nominees out there, and especially in the housing counseling section, and we could have doubled our list without a problem. But our actual goal was to get some names out there and some recognition, and we encouraged some people to apply so that there would be holes filled. And some of it was people who had deep knowledge of housing counseling but would fill in under the lender slot. So that's why Graciela, many of you may remember Graciela Ponte, now Ponte Diaz. She worked for NCLR for a number of years, has been on our call, did a lot of work with the housing counseling field, went to Center for Responsible Lending, and is now at the Self-Help Federal Credit Union, and which is a very progressive credit union network in North Carolina, in Illinois, on the West Coast, and maybe other locations as well, but doing very powerful lending. And she has a deep knowledge about counseling, so she kind of brings both sets of these things in here. Peter Skillern, who's been in our meetings, runs Reinvestment Partners in North Carolina. They're CDFI, so again, they can be thought of as a lender, also runs a very good housing counseling program and helps network with counseling groups in the Southeast, and has done a lot of work with banks as well. Eric Dahl from M&T Bank up in New York State, somebody who also ran a housing counseling program, but fits into the category of a more traditional banker. So you all know Afreen Alam. We're at our HUD task force. Courtney Biscardi in Florida with Urban League, running some valuable and model programs. Looks like we misspelled her first name a little bit. There's an extra, the first N shouldn't be there. Ellie Pepper got our nomination, and she does a lot of great advocacy work and thinking in our field. Jason Thomas, rural Maine, gives us a good slice of that work, obviously a seasoned practitioner. Judy Hunter on the West Coast, but also deep knowledge about not only housing counseling, but rural is her specialty, and been a very high-level advocate for counseling, especially for small agencies, and she would also represent an intermediary. Sharon Barker in New Jersey, lots of deep policy experience and in a more urbanized setting, which was important in the conversation. Sylvia Alvarez, who has been on some of our calls and has been in many of our meetings, and is in Tampa, Florida, a long veteran of our work. And Yvette Young, who's in Virginia and has been in many of our meetings and is experienced at running a smaller agency and not in a big city. On the consumer side, Julia Gordon has been on our calls, and you get to read her in the newspaper and see her on the news. She's with CAP, and I'm thrilled to say she's taken a real interest in housing counseling and in thinking about how to broaden our impact and bring new voices in outside of the counseling field to support counseling. We'll hopefully do more with her over the next year, but she was interested in applying, and she'll bring a lot of information as a consumer advocate, and that's the role we thought she would fit into. Jeff Gentes is at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, was deeply involved in our work with HSBC and with improving servicing standards. Is a legal services type lawyer. It's actually the Fair Housing Center, but he, very in the weeds, understanding how specific deals work, works closely with housing counselors, so very positive relationship. And then in the real estate field, felt it was really important to get somebody who understood our side of the fence and also had the bigger picture. I was very pleased they were able to get Gary Acosta to apply. He's the head of the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Very valuable organization out there. Does a lot of progressive work on the policy side, but really represents small businesses, small real estate and mortgage origination businesses that are Hispanic and do really, really good work. So having them on as a possibility, I just was that would be great. So again, please don't take this as didn't quite get everybody on the list. We may not have known about you, but also the idea was not to be comprehensive, but to try to fill in some of the missing pieces. So it'll be interesting to see how they handle all this. It's hopefully, I know a number of other good nominations have been made, so it should be a good committee no matter what. Okay, so one quick note on HCO. So we are engaged with FHFA about what the problems are. On Monday at 3 o'clock, people have told me already that they're interested in HCO. They should know about this. It's Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Monday, this is my mistake, it's not Matthew's. It's Tuesday at 3. Monday is Memorial Day, and I'm hopefully, my daughter's graduating this weekend. Very exciting. Last kid leaving college, and so I won't be in town, but so it's Tuesday at 3, and that was my mistake. But we're going to sit down and try to, we have a bunch of complaints about HCO, try to make it into a little bit more coherent list, decide who the team will be to talk to FHFA, and then next week there's a meeting scheduled with FHFA. So for those of you that have been complaining about HCO, our goal here is to make all the complaints very specific. So take it beyond it doesn't work well and can't do what I want to very specific nitty-gritty things that we need to get them to address. Interestingly enough, talking with Bill Merrill at FHFA right after the meeting and mentioning this to him, he also said that we should tell them where we want HCO to go. And what I mean by that is what are not just the most specific immediate fixes, but what can we do to make HCO a much more effective program? It's unlikely that Fannie Mae will invest in HCO on the scale that we need it to invest in. So we should make a list of things to do that would bring it into the 21st century. And this may be that it gets detached from Fannie Mae and then it needs to be handed over someplace else. And one of the critical questions is, can you separate it from the Fannie Mae underwriting machinery that it was built around, the platform that was built around? I think there's two answers to that question. So Bill said actually that it could, so that's very exciting news. But I also thought, well, maybe what you think about is, if you're going to pull it out, is there a way to take the best of HCO but really build something new that would be more 21st century, but make sure that people don't lose their client base and all the information they've added, and that they that it's a smooth transition, whatever it is. So I don't know what the best solution is here, but this group will have a real impact on what HCO looks like going forward. So if you're interested, shoot me an email, or Matthew, actually probably Matthew, because I'm to be off tomorrow, and make sure we get the information on the meeting. Want to just encourage people to think about joining NHRC. As you can tell, a lot of things are going on. We really exist because of membership. 25% of our budget comes from membership dues. We are a much more capable and flexible organization because of this. And we're going to continue doing the work we do. We do have this great resource list for escalations on services. We do have some source lists for funding opportunities for groups and down payment assistance on the members' website. We have a series of webinars that have been being done on HUD compliance in conjunction with RCAC, which Teresa Bardwell does. I've been on some of them. They're really excellent. So we're really trying to make you happy as a member, but we crossed the line. Appreciate all your support, your contributions. This has been a great few months in 2015. I think we're seeing some broader progress and recognition. We'll keep doing this. So everybody, have a great Memorial Day weekend, and thanks so much.